It's interesting you say there's perhaps something naive in what you say there. There's a fascinating passage in your book. I think it's when you're talking about Heidegger, one of the places when you're talking about Heidegger. And you're talking about the end of philosophy. There's a quote here. You say, "Are we philosophers not bombarded by all sides by the notion that the era of philosophy is over?" And it's interesting for me in this connection, because it's as if you're saying to me, to us today, that look, there is a drift towards a loss of freedom and a loss of agency and a loss of the subjectivity, which is the platform for that agency. And that as a way of arresting that flow or compensating for it or even reversing that flow, there are clues perhaps in Heidegger, which is perhaps surprising from you, but anyway, there are clues in Heidegger when he talks about the beginning of thinking rather than philosophy, that thinking itself might be this zone in which, from a Heideggerian point of view at least, we rediscover our freedom in some way. So let me put that back to you. You said you're not a pessimist, so I'm trying to, as it were, winkle out a little bit of the optimism in what I see in your book there, in what you say about Heidegger and Heidegger's opposition between philosophy on the one hand and thinking on the other. And what I hear you saying, or read you as saying, that actually if we start more thinking and less philosophizing, we will begin to rediscover some of that subjective freedom or agency that otherwise is becoming attenuated through all the forms that you talked about, like surveillance capitalism and so on. Is that right? Is there a clue in Heidegger about that, about agency and freedom and thinking, or am I getting that wrong?
No. You are not getting it wrong. The first thing I would have said is that what makes today the situation dangerous is that, another thing that I repeat again and again, that the danger of these new limits of our freedom, surveillance capitalism and so on, is that we do not, in our daily interaction, experience this as unfree. We experience it as our full free. You can be more free than surfing the web, buying what you want, and so on and so on. So that's one of my eternal phrases. The freedom, the non-freedom that you experience it as freedom is perhaps the most dangerous non-freedom. Like, I spoke with some Chinese friends, and they told me they almost missed those times 10 years ago when state-controlled meant you look back, you see a suspicious guy following you and so on. That is no longer needed. When you mentioned Heidegger, here is maybe, and if you ask me, which is my favorite part of the book, to take a narcissistic look at my own book, it would be precisely the first part of Finale, when I deal with Heidegger and go on. My point is, and I would maybe later, if there will be time, like to ask you a question about Derrida here. My point is that the situation we were in a couple of years ago still, is that on the one hand, traditional philosophical questions were taken over by science. If you ask a guy today, do we have a free will or not? The usual answer is, let's look at brain sciences, at cognitive sciences, and so on. If you ask the mega question, was the world created? Is it eternal? Does it have a limit? They say, look at quantum cosmology, and so on. This is the position of Stephen Hawking. No, philosophy is over. On the other hand, here, Derridean deconstruction, for me, and Heidegger enter. I know about their differences, but they are, for me, in a good sense of the term, not in the bad sense, the ultimate transcendental philosophers. By transcendental, I don't mean Kantian, eternal a priori. I mean this idea of what Heidegger tries to capture with
I think you talk about, Slavoj, you talk about the transcendental, and just for the sake of our audience here, because it's one of those words that has all sorts of associations. First of all, we're not talking about transcendental as in transcendental meditation or levitation, so let's get that off the table. Number two, we're not really talking about Kant as in transcendental critique and so on. I think what you're talking about here is transcendental as human beings sitting within a horizon of judgment and perception, being grounded in a world from which they can make judgments and interpretations of their own.
Grounding is always ultimately non-transparent. And I think that this is what, would you agree? This is, as a Derrida, this is what for me Derrida at his best is doing. When Derrida is analyzing a text which claims, for example, stupid example, we have an immortal soul, Derrida would not engage in the thing directly and trying to prove that we don't have an immortal soul. He would just have said, wait a minute, when you claim we have an immortal soul, are you aware what kind of implicit presuppositions about the notion of soul, mortality, and so on you already mobilize here? And I think that Heidegger's great achievement is that in this sense he historicized the notion of transcendental horizon. He has shown that, yes, we are always thrown in a universe of meaning, but there are cuts here, cuts in the sense of this horizon of meaning, what we take as, in a good sense, prejudice is historically determined.
Okay, well, let me try and bring it back to those bits of your book, at least, which I read at least as analysis of the world today, for want of a better phrase. Now, there is a sentence you write, and I've quoted it here, I've written it down here, where you talk about the emancipatory potential of capitalist madness. And I wanted to ask you whether that's what we're talking about today, whether there is some strange equivalence between the kind of freedom that you're describing through being posited, through being determined, through the agency we might have on the one hand, and this capitalist madness on the other hand. In other words, is there any sense in which that capitalist madness that we see around us is a source of freedom, as you seem to be suggesting there?
It's a very nasty, but nasty is for me good. Question. And I would say shamelessly, yes. What I was thinking about were precisely all those apparent excesses where things, as it were, go crazy in capitalism. For example, the way money functions today, not just bitcoins and so on, but also, are we aware in what strange world we live? Are we aware that 2 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, the states were doing something which from the strict monetary standpoint should have give birth to a global catastrophe? They were printing money like crazy, distributing money outside the laws of the market, and so on and so on. And at least till now, the catastrophe didn't happen. So my idea is, here I agree, although I'm often critical of him, with my friend Yanis Varoufakis, that capitalism is radically changing today. It is no longer the old capitalism that we knew. For example, things like Bitcoin. For example, what is happening now with big companies, mega corporations, and so on. The bad thing is, of course, that this is a form of neo-feudalism, although I don't like this term. But the good thing is that isn't here, within capitalism itself, a new social space emerging? The space, for example, of the internet and so on, and that it opens up a new dimension of freedom, but at the same time, it poses an incredible danger. And this tension interests me. For example, do you remember when Elon Musk wanted to buy, was it Twitter or whatever?
Yeah, Twitter.
Yes. And then Twitter, and then he said in a moment of metaphysical madness that the future of our civilization depends on this. Because if I own it, I will keep it free. If another big company or state owned it, it will encroach upon our freedom. But these are, if I may put it like this, signs of the system falling apart in some sense in itself. That's what gives me some hope. But yeah.
Well, let me pursue that. I mean, you, I think, used the word earlier, naive. I wonder if some people listening into this might wonder if that's a little bit naive to think that there is that benign side to capitalism. I mean, setting aside the oddities of Elon Musk's personality,
yes.
Let's say Elon Musk had bought Twitter, and part of his purpose beyond the profit that he might make was to secure a space for free speech and so on, you know, and in that, to that extent, something that you would endorse because you're a progressive, maybe communist, whatever philosopher, you believe in freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Of course. I think the criticism some people might level at you is, well, that's fine, but it's still owned by Elon Musk, and he could still shape, censor, limit, control, influence the dialogue that's supposedly free on Twitter, should he wish to. And in any case, what about all the advertising and all the rest of it that's creating the context in which those supposedly free discussions and thoughts are happening? So just help the skeptics with that criticism. I mean, are you being a little bit naive about that?
Okay, I have a double answer here. First, I like the word naivety because quite often, don't you agree, our first naive impression is more truthful. In what sense? Look at the Ukraine. I hate people who say it's not so simple that Russia attacked, the situation is more complex. Yeah, but we shouldn't forget the basic fact that Russia brutally attacked another independent country. But what I want to say is that I am not here naively optimist. At the same time, I would say that I am, okay, let's take Elon Musk Twitter. But don't you think that at the same time, in what sense does he open a new potential space of freedom? He centralizes the field. But what if then we, not literally, but corporatively, institutionally, cut off his head and impose some kind of very transparent social control? Didn't he in reality make this business pretty easy? You know, the machine is here. It shouldn't be controlled by a single individual. But the point is not individual or not. The point is that it should be in some sense publicly controlled, not in this mystifying communist sense that the party stands for the public, but in the sense that control itself should be publicly clear. Yes, we have to be controlled today because of the pandemic. Global warming will impose tremendous new levels of control, what we spend and so on. But it should be absolutely clear what is controlled. So I'm not naive in the sense of, oh, look, freedom there. I think we live in an extremely dangerous times. And I precisely want to avoid reading today's time, today's constellation, either in a too much pessimistic way, we are lost, we will become just wheels and cogs in some mega machine, or in a naive optimist way.
Okay.
I return to Heidegger, sorry, just one second, to Heidegger and Derrida, what Lacan, I'm mixing them together now, you know, this is crazy, so clearly is that don't forget that what Lacan called the big other, what Heidegger called being thrown into, all this remains here. And my approach to classical Marxism, I think you find it in the first chapter of the book, is that Marx was here still too confident that in communism, this opaque dimension of the big other will somehow disappear. There, you know, I'm proud of that, how I point out that Marx all of a sudden then doesn't speak about worker, but as if there is a single worker which will do planning and so on and so on. Well, hopefully for us, we will never arrive at that.
That gives me, I think, maybe quite a nice segue to maybe the last topic before we go back to questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Because you talk, you know, you're pleased with that part of the book where you talk about Marx at the beginning of classical Marxism, and you talked about the opacity of capitalism in Marx gradually disappearing, or him being optimistic that it might gradually disappear, or the mystifications of capitalism might ebb away over time. That sort of Marx's belief based a little bit on Hegel. But the question I want to finish with, actually, Slavoj, because it crops up not just in this book, but in your last book. And I remember as a student reading some of your very first book, you know, Sublime Objective Ideology, you know, one of your early hits. I remember reading that. And even then, the word madness.
Unfortunately, it's still the biggest hit.
Is it really? Well, okay. That was your sort of Lennon-McCartney yesterday, was it? I have noticed, and I've not read everything by you by any stretch, but I do notice the word madness come up again and again in different forms. And I wanted to ask you about madness. Obviously, you've written about Lacan. You don't really write about Foucault particularly. You touched on him. But obviously you write about Lacan, who's probably the closest you come, I imagine, to a sort of critic of madness. But anyway, the point I want to get to here is there any sanity? Where is the sanity, if anywhere, when you look out at the world?
I will try to give very good question. First, let me make a move towards yourself. In one of my earlier books, I have a whole chapter on the legendary debate between Foucault and Derrida.
Yeah.
Foucault accusing Derrida that he overestimates the moment of Cartesian madness, while Derrida insists that the Cartesian moment is this zero level of radical madness, which every thinking has to presuppose. I'm here on Derrida's side. I link crucial points in Hegel to another person's eye. You see this absolute abyss, night of the world, and so on. As it were, the world, the abyss before the world is constituted. And my point is here the one which you already find in Hegel, in the beginning of part 3 of his encyclopedia, in a very Derridean way, where he says that in the passage, to put it naively, from animals to humans, the first step is madness. And then our discourse is an attempt to control this madness, but the threat of madness, Hegel points out, remains all the time. Our sanity can only be understood as a retroactive attempt to control our founding madness. Hegel says this. I think I simplify now very much, that there is something similar in Derrida's counter attack. Okay, it's a very high quality debate.